I'm George from Ireland, so welcome back to my channel once again. Anyway, in this video I'm asking, what is Russia's strategy in Ukraine? Because the war's been going on for, my goodness, nigh on 8 months now. Remember the so-called special military operation, which is supposed to be only 3 days in duration. You may recall that just 3 days into the conflict, the Russian government released a communique, and it was on various websites saying, that's it, we've done it, victory, we've triumphed, Russia, Ukraine and Belarus are now going to be fully united, which shows that Russia's goals went far, far beyond regime change, which they pretended it was, and preventing, Ukraine ever joining NATO, ever joining the European Union, Putin's so-called demilitarization. Obviously, Ukraine is entitled to armed forces just like any other sovereign nation, and Ukraine needs them more so than any other sovereign nation because they're of the tyrant, their neighbor, which has brutalized them, which has carried out many large-scale atrocities, numerous massacres of civilians, numerous murders of prisoners of war, wide-scale torture, the deliberate targeting of civilians in hospitals, and so forth. And Ukraine has the absolute right to conduct its own foreign policy, to apply for membership of NATO, to apply for membership of the European Union, and Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity was explicitly guaranteed by Russia in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which would teach you to never ever trust the Russian government at all. Obviously guaranteed by the United States and the United Kingdom, which is why they're morally obliged to arm the Ukrainians now and to so-called denazify Ukraine. That was one of Putin's goals, which was yet another flagrant lie, as the Ukrainian government is not remotely Nazi. It's the Russian government, which is far more Nazi, being hyper-nationalistic, militaristic, carrying out so many gross human rights abuses on an absolutely enormous scale, being violently intolerant of peaceful dissent, and so forth. Appealing to religious bigotry, to racial bigotry, having completely unfair trials, having flagrant elections, having this preposterous cult of the personality around their dictator, and so on. So, but Ukraine's is obviously given the Russians much more fight than they expected, given the Ruskies a real run for their money. So the Ukrainian metal has been an unpleasant surprise for the Russian military. They sent in that new general, Vikin, to take over. And remember, he's known for his numerous crimes against humanity in Syria and Chechnya. So obviously the Russians are trying to stop the Ukrainian counterattack, the Ukrainians liberating illegally occupied land. And the Russians have little success with that they are pressuring Bakhmut to largely surround it and just pulverize it with artillery until it caves in. But they mobilized 460,000 troops in September. Now they've got at least 220,000 actually there. Well, that's what the Russian government claims. I'll be lower than that, but they will get more. They might not get up to 460,000. They've officially ended that mobilization. So certainly for the moment, they're not going to draft anybody else because the Russian army can't even cope with the draftees it's got, which is even by their own admission, half the 460,000 that they wanted to call up. Don't have uniforms for them, don't have weapons for them. They're called to barracks. There might be no beds, no food, no officers or NCOs to train them. Obviously, in some cases they do get a full uniform. And when I say a full uniform, they might get bits of it, but not all the kit they're supposed to get. They might have some weapons, but sometimes not in workable condition and things like that. So there's this complete chaos. It shows the broader dysfunctionality of the Russian government. And that they did have a good draft system in place 20 years ago to call people up if they needed them, and it was all ready to go. But Putin, he let that fall by the wayside, thinking they wouldn't need it, wanted to slim down to a more professional army, able to fight a more sophisticated war. War is more high-tech than ever before. There's little point in having people in the army for 1 year, because by the time you make them half-decent soldiers, they're gone. And because war is increasingly complex, then they have to have more time to learn these difficult skills. So even though the numbers are helping, if even a tenth of those sent to the front are decently trained and decently equipped, that's going to make a small difference. So obviously to try and stop the Ukrainian advance, push back what they can, pull out of Kherson, they realized that's really just indefensible. So kidnapping Ukrainian civilians, bringing them across the Dnipro River, and partly using them as human shields, because the Ukrainians will think twice about blowing up these pontoon bridges that yes, are evacuating Russian troops, but also Ukrainian civilians. Now the Russians might have to leave behind some of the material. This time they've usually got time to sabotage it, the tanks and artillery, if they can't get them out, just render them beyond use, so the Ukrainians can't use them against the Russians themselves. Possibly to blow up a dam over the Dnipro River to flood a lot of southern Ukraine and then force refugees to go elsewhere in Ukraine or indeed abroad. There are obviously millions of internally displaced people, as well as several million Ukraine refugees in Western countries. So place more of an economic burden on Western countries, hoping that Western opinion will gradually turn against Ukrainians. We've had too many Ukrainian refugees. There's very little sign of that so far. They're too expensive. They're taking our jobs. They're bad. So to try and provoke anti-Ukrainian sentiment. So remember, this is hybrid warfare that a Russian general laid out in a public lecture, something like 20 years ago. So it's obviously through military action. Hello there. The result will affect him domestically. It depends whether he wins or loses. It will affect him fairly negatively at the moment because the cost is so high and the gain is so low. So obviously, this hybrid warfare through military means obviously psychological operations through propaganda in the public sphere, through damaging the enemy economically, through things like cyber attacks, obviously lying about the cyber attacks, and they're blatant, to demoralize people, putting things on websites, to deprive people of water, gas, electricity, or whatever. And this particularly what they're doing in Ukraine now is they're deliberately targeting civilian energy infrastructure, which is expressly prohibited under the Geneva Convention. So yet another war crime that Russia has committed there. I mean, in a way, I dislike saying Russia. I'm not trying to blaming all Russians or most Russians. Obviously, there are plenty of good Russians, just as there's some bad Ukrainians. No nationality is all bad or all good, and no nation is guilty and no nation is innocent. There are guilty and innocent individuals, perhaps even organizations, but I'm not Russophobic in the least. And Ukraine obviously getting so cold in the winter, -20 easily, that will be the death of millions of civilians. And what can Ukraine's allies do? Provide them with a lot of, let's say, electric generators, which are powered by whatever liquid fuels. But there's got to be a lot of those fast, and obviously you've got to be sending in by truck enough oil or whatever it is, gas, I don't know if it's petroleum or diesel or whatever for these things. They're very noisy, but they work. And Ukraine is supposed to be completely hooked up to the European electric grid in 2023. Now that work may have slowed down due to the war. Situation for it might become like Afghanistan for the Soviets. Well, possibly, but obviously the Ukrainians are a conventional army, much better armed. Ukraine is obviously a high-tech country. I mean, not on the scale of Japan or the USA or something, where Afghanistan was very low-tech, which actually was easy for them because there's no infrastructure to bomb, more or less, especially in the Mujahideen-held areas. And they didn't produce any of their own weapons or anything like that. They didn't have running water anyway. They didn't have electricity, so you couldn't demoralize them by doing that. The Soviets tried to destroy the Afghan economy by killing their herds and flocks and so on, to starve them, and killed millions of civilians in doing that. And I mean millions, which is a part of the Afghan conflict which is not widely understood abroad. So remember, this is a war with absolutely no holds barred for Putin. There is no ethical limit. There's no legal limit. He's a man of bottomless immorality. And was even challenged by American journalists about this in about 1999, about this conflict which he deliberately caused in in Chechnya, by murdering several hundred Russian civilians in Moscow, Voronezh, and elsewhere with apartment block bombings. Said, what about these very credible reports, dozens of reports from very respected human rights organizations about enormous war crimes committed by your troops in Chechnya? And he didn't even dispute that his troops were doing this. We'll say, well, what do you expect me to do? You know, these people are bad, and if we're fighting, yeah, sure, we're going to kill civilians. He didn't explicitly say it, but he shrugged it off. Well, I mean, of course, you know, in war, we're going to do that. And no, you don't have to do that. I know all armies do wrong. It depends how often and on what scale, and do they try and stop it? Do they prosecute their own people? And Russian soldiers will be virtually never prosecuted for crimes against enemy civilians or prisoners of war or things like that. So to break Ukrainian civilian morale by depriving them of water, gas, electricity, so on, to freeze them to death, and obviously soldiers to death, you could provide more people more absolute zero suits or something like that. But there's about 30 million Ukrainians in the free area, and that'd be very expensive to provide all those absolute zero suits. So it's going to be difficult. It's partly that, maybe ending the grain deal next month to deprive Ukraine of money, because he's got to up the ante. Going as it's going, the Russians are being slowly squeezed out. Obviously, threats of weapons of mass destruction, which I predicted, I think he will use at some point next month, or else it is a bluff, and we'll know it. So there's no point sending more troops to Ukraine, because, as I say, the Russian army, the commissariat, can't even cope with the ones they got there, let alone more. And if they're not untrained, they will be at best of no utility, maybe even a danger to their own side, accidentally shooting their own side, getting in the way, getting shot themselves, being mistaken for Ukrainians and things like that. And is causing a brain drain to accelerate, so many wealthy, educated Russians fleeing. Chechnya is Russian's territory, which that's true, it is its sovereign territory. Some of them were Islamic fundamentalist supporters, and some of them were secularists, like Dzhokhar Dudayev. And Putin tries to pretend that he's fighting against Islamist theocrats. Well, actually, he's put one in charge now. There's a Shariat state on Putin's own home territory. Ramazan Kadyrov is in charge, who's brought back Sharia law, who's deliberately murdering gay men, who's got several wives and things like that. So no, I don't accept that he's actually against this. He'll pretend to be against it. Time of the war on terror, he thought, well, then Occidentals have some fellow feeling against me, and it's actually often Chechen liberals and secularists he's killing. If he uses weapons of mass destruction, NATO may occupy Western Central Ukraine. I don't think they will. I think there'll be other sorts of another sort of response. So anyway, thank you so much for watching my channel. So please subscribe. Thank you for a donation on PayPal, somebody. Make sure you're subscribed on Patreon. What about the lack of action? Yeah, I think Western countries were wrong not to take firmer action. I'm not necessarily against donations to the Conservative Party by Russian oligarchs, so long as they were lawful donations. Not all oligarchs are pro-Putin. I know that obviously Russia had an arguable case around Crimea. It doesn't have an arguable case about the rest of Ukraine. And obviously its ambitions are limited, and there have been many more atrocities. One person was killed in the Russian illegal occupation of Crimea. But perhaps it set a dangerous precedent. We should have taken a harder line on that and prevented more aggression. We should have armed the Ukrainians to the teeth, such that they were capable of defending themselves, and perhaps this current war would never have broken out. So I can't remember how to say parabellum, what's that word for ready, pacem or whatever. If you want peace, prepare for war. All right, goodbye everyone. Thank you for watching.